Thanks for coming today on a beautiful day like that. I really appreciate it. I'm delighted to, well, I'm going to do a little bending over here, it looks like, for a few minutes. Before I do anything, I have a big fat note to remind me to say how grateful I am to the Olive Free Library for this opportunity. This exhibition space is remarkable. I've held this exhibition in 3 different places now, and this is really one of the most outstanding, one of the 3 most outstanding. I looked around the room, I just didn't want to offend anybody. No, but I mean, really, wow, what a place to get a view of the whole thing, which is really, really a great thing for an artist to be able to see. So thank you, Chrissy, and your staff has been amazing. And I also want to thank my friend Elaine Ralston, who was the curator of the show and the great Olive Art program. It's been is that what you call it? The Olive Art program? Art committee? Anyway, whatever it is, it's great, and thank you for having me. And I do appreciate that. So thank you. I'm really here to set a tone today, so it doesn't turn into the Geraldo Rivera show. I mean, we won't have any of that. I'll channel my mother, the great Mimi McGloughlin. If things feel like they're getting wild, I'll just go like this, and we'll remember ourselves. And I'm delighted to have these panelists with me, and I'm going to introduce them in just a few minutes. But I thought I'd just say a few things so you know where I'm coming from on this. I'm Kate McGloughlin, if you don't know. Some of you that I don't know, nice to meet you. I want to tell you, and I'm going to read this because when I go off the cuff, sometimes I forget really important things. My goal is to create an environment where people can respectfully ask questions and get clear answers to debunk or prove myths encircling the DEP land acquisition program. My motive is to keep communication open between Olivites and their neighbors at the New York Board of Water Supply, and hopefully inform, in a small way anyway, my neighbors about the need to protect the watershed and also to protect certain historical sites in Olive as well, with a trajectory of creating an historic district in Olive. That's my end game. I really want us to have that. To put today's panel in context of the broader scope of all my work, I'll say that I've been trying to find my way through the brambly path of generational trauma that resulted from the disruption that occurred a few generations ago during the clearing of the Esopus Valley, and navigating the remnants of resentment and bewilderment that I have struggled with as a result of this injury. The work I've done for these exhibitions has been cathartic and enlightening, and we're all done with the hope of healing as a possible outcome. It worked. Some of us prefer to live in the past. Some of us have been stuck there against our will. I believe that with good, open discussion and acknowledgement of the past and a clear, informed view of the present, almost assuredly we can hope for a renewed, peaceable vision for the future. I've met new friends along the way who have guided and informed me, and I've relied on old friends to commiserate and collaborate with, to help move forward, to honor Olive's past, but be open about what is happening in the present, and see what we can do in the future to create alliances with other, to move forward in a respectful way. And with that, I'd like to introduce my old and new friends, LeAnne Avery, Associate Professor of Science Education at SUNY Oneonta, April Beisaw, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Vassar, and Adam Bosch, Director of Public Affairs, Board of Water Supply at the Department of Environmental Protection. What I'm going to have them do is say a few things about what they've been doing, their interest, how it pertains to this particular panel. I'll let them go on for about 10 minutes, and then I'll shut them down. She's got her timer over here. That's just really great. They brought me into the new world. So they're going to introduce some things. They've got some slides. They've got a lot of information. They come at this from 3 different perspectives. We're very allied in a lot of ways, and then we have some divergent points of view, like probably the audience here. So we just want to create an environment where you can find out things. We'll talk for a while. I have some questions that I'd like to ask them for your benefit, and then there'll be a time at the end for you to ask some questions yourself. I will ask that you'll be respectful of my panel and be, measured in your questions, and I just expect a really respectful afternoon, that's all. And otherwise, I'll get my Mimi McGloughlin out, and you'll get the kindergartner look, and you'll know to settle down. How's that? So here we go. I think I'd like to have April talk about what she's doing, and here's April Beisaw, everybody.
Thank you, Kate. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. I hope you're very full but not ready to take a nap. That was yesterday, right? Although I've already had leftovers today. So when I come to Olive, and I've been coming to Olive as a researcher for the last 8 years, this is more of what I usually look like. Someone who kind of, yes?
Could you turn those lights off so we can see the slides clearer?
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll
And I
take
have a
it
great
in.
introduction for her that I'm going to read too before you go on.
Do I have to restart the timer?
Wait a second. This is a great one. Dr. April Beisaw is an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie. There she teaches courses on archaeology, forensic anthropology, Native America, and environmental studies. She began studying the changes New York City brought to Olive in 2012. But April's first visit to Olive was sometime in the 1970s during a family vacation from their Long Island home. There you go. Start your clock over.
Thank you. So as I was saying, I usually look like this. So if you see me around Olive, I always try to wear something that says Vassar on it so that you guys could recognize me. And I often have 3 to 10 students in tow. But we go on the properties that are owned by New York City and are these land acquisition recreation areas. And we document the past that is right there on the surface. We don't disturb the ground at all. So we're just hiking and we're mapping and recording. And the photo on the right was taken by one of my students that just shows some of the artifacts that I'm sure you guys are all used to seeing, that to somebody like me tells me what used to happen on that property, or if it's a dump zone, who might be dumping on these properties. So I'm not just looking at Olive, I'm also looking at the town of Kent in Putnam County. So this illustration is from one of those New York Times articles they do every couple of years that say, it's the champagne of tap water and it comes from natural sources, and it ignores all you guys, right? So the Boyd's Corner Reservoir is that star down there that is technically in the Croton watershed, but is connected to the Catskill watershed. And then you guys know where you are. So I'm looking in Olive as just an analytical unit. So I kind of ignore Hurley a little bit just because Kingston has had so much influence on Hurley, and Olive doesn't have a similar city. But you can see the next map over is the town of Kent. And the kind of mauve, brownish, I don't know what color that is. This color.
Rust.
Rust, says the artist, I will trust her. The rust color in both the towns is all New York City recreation units, and the green is state-owned land. And the Kent map has a lot of pushpins in there because there's just lakes upon lakes being created, and only the blue pushpin ones are original. So there's almost nothing left in Kent except for the mountaintops. And there's almost nothing left in Olive other than the mountaintops and the valleys. So my archaeological perspective on what's been going on is 150 years of a perspective. So when the New York City system starts and they start looking for water to bring to Manhattan, it was a very stupid idea to create a city on an island surrounded by salt water. And for 150 years, communities have been demolished so that the city could keep growing. And it no longer just feeds Manhattan, it feeds larger and larger areas. So the needs keep going up. That isn't just New York City. So this is the 150-year pattern that is very robust. A water issue arises. Then there's the displacement of some people, usually people lower on the socioeconomic spectrum, not always. And they say it's for the greater good. And then you know what happens? A couple years later, a water issue arises and some more people get displaced. And this cycle seems to be never ending. And doing archaeology, we could look at these actual properties and how they're being used now, how they were used in the past. And I see there's the conflict that's going on in the community is reflected on these properties. So these DEP lands, the Department of Environmental Protection lands, all contain ruins. And I know everybody here is very concerned about the ruins that are in the reservoir, but there are ruins all around us right here that nobody's paying attention to because we're so focused on what's in the reservoir. So I go to every single New York City Department of Environmental Protection land that is open to hiking, and I document things like building foundations. There's one just on the end of Wispel Road on what's the South Mountain Recreation Unit. And I ask the kinds of questions that are, whose house is this and why was it abandoned? Right? It's evidence that people lived there and did things there. And some of these properties, they lived there and did things very recently. On the Black Road property, there are building foundations, and there is also a stone wall network that is bigger, wider, taller than anywhere else. And on all the historic maps, there's nothing there, right? So I ask, what functions did these properties once serve that are no longer being served in your town? So that helps me answer the question, what is being lost when these properties are being acquired by the city? And then, how are these lands being used today? So that's the Broadhead Recreation Unit. That's somebody's hot water heater. There's a lot of dumping going on these properties. And I'm not here to get anybody in trouble for anything, but it's the Department of Environmental Protection, and almost every property I find an abandoned car. All right. So what is being gained by these properties? And in the town of Olive, I never see anybody recreating on these recreation lands, partially because you can't find them, you can't get on them, and then as soon as you get out of your car, you're covered in ticks from head to toe. There are no trails, there's no signage, there's nothing. So I have a little bit of an issue with calling them recreation properties. So when I compare Olive and Kent, these are the recreation properties and the number of acres. So the town of Olive and the town of Kent. And then I total the number of acres and compare it to the total acreage of the town land. And in both Kent and Olive, New York City DEP land is 15% of the towns. Not a coincidence, right? And it's growing. It keeps adding. So the story for Kent is that in 1867, New York City says, we just need 425 acres. That's not a lot. They displace some people, they take away a cemetery, they dig people up. Now, New York City owns 10 times that. And most people aren't paying attention to know that that's going on. So now in the town of Kent, just the recreation land is 4,000 acres, and they own other land in addition to that. Almost every parcel has ruins that tell me people lived there, what they did there. And in the town of Kent, you actually can access the recreation units. They have parking lots and signs, and there's more dumping. There's refrigerators and things like that in the woods. So access isn't necessarily a great thing, but you can't say it's recreation if nobody could get to it. So in Olive, in 1906, the city takes 4,000 acres for the Ashokan Reservoir, and now they have had acquired another 5,500 for recreation units. So what happened in 1906 has happened again, but who's paying attention to tally all these things up? So again, 15% of the land is their recreation units, and most have ruins of past land use on them. So my conclusions, one of the things I've done, and I have a big packet here if anybody wants to look at it, and two small ones, is Kate said, hey, what do we want to preserve? So I've documented the ruins on the New York City properties, and I've registered them as archaeology sites with the State Historic Preservation Office. So the state archaeologist agrees with me that these are archaeological sites and they have the history of your town there. I'm also looking for permissions and getting things lined up to maybe do some archaeological excavation. So the ruins are not just in the reservoir, but all around. And then these historic sites demonstrate that what happened then is still happening now. So this is a postcard of the pulp mills at Brown Station. And if you read the writing, it says, "Dear Haiti, I suppose this will be gone when the waterworks comes." Right? And it seems like that's still the conversation that's going on. And it's been happening throughout the watersheds. This is Mrs. Parker's house from Kent, that I'm with someone from the Kent Historical Society. And right next to her house is her family cemetery where she's buried. And this is all on city-owned land now. And then the last point is that these properties are vacated, not vacant land. And some of it is from sellers who really have little choice. So my research is entering the stage where I want to help people decide what should be documented before it's lost, and maybe what should we protect. So I have up here just 2 copies of what one of my students put together to propose what might be part of a historic district. So if anybody wants to look at those or even take those, that's fine with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beisaw. I've started calling her April. Hope that's all right.
That's fine.
So like I said, there's going to be time to ask questions of the professionals afterwards, but I just want to keep this flowing if you don't mind. One of my oldest friends in the world is here today, and she's going to talk to you about place. This is Dr. LeAnne Avery.
Well, I will tell you also.
I didn't write out your thing. Don't start the clock. She's a professor. She teaches science teachers up in Oneonta. And what's wonderful about LeAnne is that she's teaching people how to teach little smaller people with the end game of having beautiful science teachers emerge from everywhere. And we're not the only people who like to crawl around in the ponds, although we surely did enough of that. But there's all kinds of professionals on the DEP and down at Vassar who like to do the same thing. Anyway, this is LeAnne Avery.
Thank you. Is this the one? Yep. Well, I'm going to try not to strangle you. So standing still is very hard for me, and I was going to say, I thought I had a big enough mouth not to use this, but
No, keep it on.
all right. So welcome. I'm delighted to be here, and so my talk is about it's a historical perspective, and I'm going to talk to you about how place connections are really complex and why that matters. And hopefully we'll get the technology to work. Okay, so basically what I'm doing and sharing with you today is bringing in the research that I have done over the years, and what I've done is document what I call local rural knowledge, and that's knowledge that children have possess as well as community elders, and it's knowledge and skills they've learned often in places outside of school. So that's the work that you'll see. I'll describe that and then talk about how that knowledge evolves and how does that connect it to place. And then the other point, if time allows, but probably during question and answer period, this sort of comes together around the case of the Ashokan Reservoir. And I've been doing some work, because I grew up here, but looking at the original takings, claims, hearings, and some amazing artifacts at the town clerk's office. So that's been a really interesting investigation. So, full disclosure, I've been here like Kate, many, many generations on both sides of my family. Some of you probably know my mother's Helen Jeffs, my grandparents Nelson and Nettie Boyce had Boyce's General Store. The Averys, and every name possible close to Avery were all related. My dad was Alvin Avery. Sorry, Mom, I just said that, but the Boyces. So, a little background. So, full disclosure meaning, not only do I do this academic gig, but I am very vested in this place that I call home, and my rural roots run deep. And this has been a journey for me to come back and go through this process. So I've been enjoying that. You're going to have to show me how I'm doing on time. All right. So when I started doing the work I'm doing, that's the barn. You may know the barn. I know Gary knows the barn, and Karen. When I looked at, there's a lot of knowledge I know children and community elders have. I'm going to go look for literature to better understand what that means, especially around rural settings. Of course, I didn't find any, not surprising. We'll get to that. So I've borrowed a lot from what is called indigenous scholarship. So I use a lot of the work that Native Americans and other scholars have used in indigenous communities to look at what I call rural knowledge. So that's the backdrop. See, these are some of the resources I've used. I'm happy to talk about them, but what's really important is you'll see a really strong connection between people and place and ecology and other living beings. It's not an us and them. That indigenous scholarship looks at these very intense connections, and we see that also with community elders, which I'll talk about in a few moments. So what I've come to talk about and learn is that children have a lot of knowledge, and I look at what children have learned in science and because I do science teacher education, science and engineering. And what I've done is give children photographs to take pictures, cameras, and have children take pictures of anything they feel is science and or engineering, and how do they learn about it in places outside of school. It's called photo documentation, and from that I've learned children have a lot of knowledge and skills connected to place. I have done something similar with community elders, and that was spurred by my mom, Helen, who told me, you know, you need to write this stuff down because one of these days we're not going to be here. And she was right. And I did listen to her, and I did document that, and you may see some familiar faces soon. So a lot of the knowledge that people have across generations is strongly connected to place. In fact, this photo documentation, really quickly, is here's an example of a child who's looking through photographs, now digital, prior to that, not digital, and laying out pictures, and I would interview her, and she would describe what she's seen, how she's learned a particular thing. This young lady grew up on a dairy farm, and she talked about the processes of feeding animals and growing crops. Here's another young man who talked about and made a connection between levers and science, looking at a rescue site, a practice run using a jaw of life or to take a car apart. And on it goes. This is what happens when you so in my world, when you interview people, we have to do something called a human subjects research proposal, which means you have to protect confidentiality, particularly of minors or children. So when you let them make up their own names, this is what you get, just so you know. And the children talk about growing up on a farm. That's where I've spent most of my life. I take what I've learned outside of school and try to bring it into school. And Justin Timberlake also shows up, which I thought this was a really interesting perspective. And this child actually had many health issues, and I think her health issues gave her a unique perspective. So for example, this is like an 11-year-old girl on the left, and she said she looked at a train station, she looks at a firehouse, and she said, you know, these inspire me because when I look at a train station, I look at it from a different point of view. I look at it as a building with many, many memories because that building has been around since before I was born. I put things in different perspectives, and you know, some people just might look at a fire department and a building and not think about what it is. The whole community helps with that. And if it weren't for those firefighters, where would we be? So children, my point, children see these connections. We often spend time in education taking those connections apart, unfortunately, and standardizing things. But children come with a connection to nature. They come with a connection to their community. There's my mom, and many of you in this room may have grown up hearing things called local rural tenets, and often these are associated with weather-related events. The leaves, it smells like it's going to rain. When the leaves turn, there's a storm coming. And I grew up hearing, oh, you know, that's folklore. That's not really true. So a colleague and I from Kentucky decided to say, you know, we grew up in rural areas, and we actually think it is true, and there is some science behind it. So what we did was gather all of these sayings and then sort of compare it and contrast it to traditional Western science textbooks and other types of information, and turns out, yes, there is scientific background to these tenets. So part of what we were doing is validating that. Not saying that Western science has to be the one that deems this important, but it was to prove a point. Your mom calms. I'm the one who's feisty like my mom. Didn't miss this generation. So we have children and elders that are connected to place, whether it's buildings, ecology, animals, where they grew up. All of you think they're here today because you care about place. You have emotions around place. If you think about a memory, often a story comes attached to a place or experience with people and animals and or other community members. That place elicits memory, and more research is showing that there is an attachment to place, and that impacts our affect, it impacts our emotions, our behaviors. We identify with place when we have a membership with the community, the Olivites in this community. We have membership, and our membership may vary, but we're here as a community today for similar and perhaps different reasons, but we're here. And it's around place. And I've quoted you, as you'll see shortly. As more and more work is done, we see there's a neuroscience aspect to place connection. So we say this when April shared the number of acres that have been taken, continue to be taken. It's not like a ticket list. Well, we'll take one and we'll put something back, or we'll do this. My point is, it's not that simple. When you take place and you change it, you impact the people who inhabit that place, as well as the other living beings who are there. So we know place is powerful. It has connections between people. People have desires, they have stories, they have memories. So when we have a case of, I'll get to in a moment, that's an old foundation up near the end of Moonhaw Road. That's one of my great-great-great-great-grandfathers. But place, no matter how small or large, is an epicenter of lots of different connections. So when my point in this, besides discovering, and much of the work I do is to look at rural settings, from what you said, as an asset-based perspective rather than deficit. We have a rich cultural history, we have connections, we have knowledge, and when you disrupt that, as is the case of the building of the Ashokan Reservoir, you're not just moving people out in bodies or demolishing a building. You're disrupting memories, you're disrupting community, and those roots of place run very deep. So as Kate said, there is a trauma, and it is an intergenerational experience. And I could go on for quite some time with this, and my time is up, right? So I will lastly say, the last thing I wanted to say, we'll come back to that. As we move forward, I'm going to end here and come back. And I think this is, since we're seeing this repeat, institutions conveniently forget. It's happening again. Communities don't forget. And the point of why I bring to you sort of going to a darker place about the reservoir and this knowledge is, I think in order for us, as Kate said, to move forward, we first have to look back. And we have to understand that history, and that history needs to be validated so that we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, LeAnne. Yeah, you sneak anywhere you want.
Alrighty.
Since I'm doing such a lousy job of introducing people, I'm going to let Adam introduce himself. I want to tell you something. I met all these people. I mean, LeAnne and I have been together for 100 years, but I met these people on my way to discovery and in the Bishop Museum. And I answered a letter from April, and that's why I got together with her at Marty's Mercantile. Thank God we have one coffee shop in town here, right? And we fell in quick. Then they asked me to, they're sorry they did this, but they asked me to sit in on the signage, the meetings on the rail trail signage. So they obviously needed somebody to slow the process down interminably. so they invited me, and I talked to them about color extensively. One of my blue and green again. On the blue.
Tone, she said.
No, I said sumptuous grays. It doesn't have to be like blue and green. I mean, it was like, oh my Lord. So anyway, we dealt with it, and they sort of let me in, and it was great. But one of the great things is that I got to meet the great Adam Bosch. He's the director of public affairs of the DEP, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. And 10 minutes, Adam. Are you going to get the hook?
Don't start my clock yet. I'm not done introducing myself.
Yeah.
Hold on. Great. So I'm happy to see at least 3 or 4 people who I've known for a long time here. Some of you got to know me a little bit when I was a reporter for the Times Herald Record for many, many years, left and was a reporter at the New York Times Albany Bureau for a period of time, and then I was the vice president of research at Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress, where I did a number of really in-depth demographic studies of the region and some other public policy studies. Just before I start, I do want to say, in terms of respect for history, we have a sort of a deep respect for history at DEP, and a lot of that is driven by our deputy commissioner for the water supply, Paul Rush, who's a big student of history. And in fact, when I was first hired at DEP in 2012, the first thing he handed me was a stack of historical documents that was almost as tall, half as high as I was tall. And it included anything from the original newsletters that the Board of Water Supply put out when they were building the Catskills system, to annual reports, to reports that they put out even before they knew they were going to build a water supply in the Catskills, because actually the Catskills was the second choice. They wanted to build it in Dutchess County first. So,
Except the Roosevelts lived there.
except the Roosevelts and the Livingstons and Astors lived there. That's right. That's another story for another time, but really interesting stuff. But long story short, he had always said to me, you know, if I was going to go out and do my job, which is really to try to lift the veil of mystery off the things that we do to operate, maintain, and protect this supply, that it was really important for me to understand sort of the historical underpinnings of all that work, and that includes, you know, everything that we're talking about here today. So, all right, my timer can start now. I'll give you a quick overview. A lot of you have seen this slide before, but New York City's water supply is the largest in the United States. It's a surface water supply, reservoirs, 19 reservoirs and 3 lakes. We store about 570 billion gallons at full capacity. And at this point, we're serving about half the population of New York State. So that's 8.6 million people in the 5 boroughs in New York City, and another 1 million people north of the city who live in 72 communities that have connections to our system, including 3 communities right here in Ulster County. That water comes from a watershed area, an area of land that drains into the streams, creeks, and rivers that feed the reservoirs, covers about 1.2 million acres. And as you know, 90% of the water supply is unfiltered. That's the water that comes from here in the Catskills, and some of the reservoirs down here that are connected to that system either by streams or by tunnels. Uh-oh, what's going on? Okay, here we go. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip some of this. I said I was going to self-edit. So many of you here are familiar with the Memorandum of Agreement from 1997 and the filtration avoidance waiver that we have that allows us to send this water to the city without filtration. And just going back, one of the things that happened in the early 90s as the city began to talk with the communities and the state and the environmental advocates and everyone who was involved is it understood that this really complex, broad suite of programs was really going to come in 2 flavors. One flavor was going to be programs that were remedial in nature. So those were things like fixing wastewater treatment plants that weren't working well, working in partnership with farmers to make sure nutrient-rich runoff wasn't coming off their farms, because that can affect taste and odor and algae growth and things like that. And of course, it also included preventative measures. And so land acquisition was one of the bigger preventative measures, was trying to prevent future contamination or sources of contamination by protecting some land as forever wild. Firm belief, obviously, that protecting water at its source was the most cost-effective, environmentally sound approach. You can see here there were a lot of things driving the city's approach in the 90s. We owned less than 8% of the catchment area, less than 8% of the watershed. Regulations were outdated. They talked about things like cesspools and privies and things that hadn't been in use for some time. And obviously, city leaders were alarmed by the potential cost of filtering the water that comes from the Catskills. It would cost an estimated $10 to $12 billion to build a filtration plant of that size, and about $200 million annually, mostly in chemicals and electricity. So faced with the choice of protecting water where it exists or allowing that water to get potentially contaminated and then having to use a lot of chemicals and electricity and energy at the end of a long pipe, the city chose to go toward the filtration avoidance route. I'm going to skip through this so that we can get to what we're mostly talking about here. Okay, so the 1997 Memorandum of Agreement really allowed the city to go forward with sort of the 3 core things that make up our watershed protection program. One was land acquisition. One was enhanced regulations and updated versions of those regulations that had been in place for decades. And the partnership programs, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Those are programs that are funded by the city but administered by groups like the Catskill Watershed Corporation and Watershed Ad Council to help with activities on the land that are liable to affect the quality of the water and the supply. Water supply permit is the state permit that allows the land acquisition program to go forward, required by state law. It sets rules and limits for land acquisition and how we can actually carry out land acquisition based on town-level environmental assessments. Importantly, it sets solicitation targets for the city, not acquisition targets. So if the city solicited a number of acres in a given year and didn't buy any, as long as it met its solicitation target, that was was fine with the regulators. And it limits the amount that the city can purchase during the term of the permit. And we mentioned already remediation versus forward-looking protection programs. Okay, so let's talk about the land acquisition program and get a little bit into some detail. The basics of the land acquisition program is it's set up to be a willing seller, willing buyer transaction. On every parcel that we're interested in purchasing, we get 2 independent assessments done, and we have to pay fair market value for them. No dwellings can be purchased in the Catskills. DEP pays the property taxes as assessed on those vacant lands. We're limited by the type, size, and location of the land. We have minimum size limits that we can buy based on different priority areas. So there's a larger priority near terminal reservoirs. Those are reservoirs that can, under some operating scenarios, send water directly into the city, and higher priorities near our intakes. That way we're being maximally protective of the areas that matter most. Natural features criteria. So in order to buy a parcel of land, it has to meet certain criteria. It has to have certain amount of steep slopes or water features on it. That gets back to making sure that that parcel of land has a tangible effect on water quality. Local consultation required by the MOA. We have to let towns know about the parcels that we're purchasing once we reach contract. And there is a review process for whether or not to open those for public access. And those solicitation targets are, once again, set by the different priority areas. Here's the different priority areas, as you can see, starting with the biggest priority areas are purple and red. You can see those are around our terminal reservoirs, so Ashokan and Rondout. Those 2 reservoirs, under certain configurations of the system, can actually send water directly into the city, and that has happened recently. And also near the intakes. So you see here's the intake at Rondout Reservoir. All of you know the intake right in the middle there of Ashokan Reservoir, and then some of the other intakes here at Cannonsville, Papacton, and right on the bottom of Never Sink there by Never Sink Dam. Program implementation. Something interesting about the land acquisition program is it's really sort of evolving over the years, and I think this chart shows a little bit of that. You can see as we get here into the 2010s, there are other programs coming into form. So we've been piloting a streamside acquisition program that's probably going to get larger, where we're buying just the lands immediately adjacent to the streams and not these larger parcels. Forest conservation easements that are being done by our partners at the Watershed Ad Council, and some of the flood buyout programs, the city-funded flood buyout programs, where there have been homes who've been flooded repeatedly over and over and over again, but for one reason or another didn't qualify for FEMA buyout programs, yet every time they get flooded, obviously it's devastating for the homeowner, and everything in their garage ends up in the reservoir. So there was some mutual benefit to doing that as well. You can see implementation-wise, there was really quite an uptick in the number of purchase transactions that the city was doing early in the program, and again around the Great Recession, right? There was a big bump, and that was a bump experienced by a lot of land conservation groups, whether it was DEP or Scenic Hudson or OSI. There was a bump in purchases and preservation during that time. And really you can see 2 things really begun to dwindle in recent years, but also diversify the types of purchases that we're doing to protect those lands that are ultimately feeding the streams that go into the reservoirs. Land acquisition, just some numbers I thought you'd find interesting. So the total watershed area in the Catskills is just a little more than 1 million acres. Of that, the total protected area is just a little more than 400,000 acres. New York State lands, that includes New York State lands, about 206,000 acres. New York City, we're about 175,000. And then others, really different land conservancies for the most part. New York City lands owned by program, so pre-MOA, those were the lands that the city took ownership of when the reservoirs were being built. Land acquisition program is just the typical fee purchase, a straight out land purchase. We do have some conservation easements out there, some farm conservation easements and some forest conservation easements. And then you can see the streamside acquisition program is really still just getting started, and those flood buyout properties tend to be a little smaller. Here in the Ashokan Basin, total watershed area is 163,000 acres, a little more. Total protected is 103,000 acres, so a higher level of protection here in Ashokan, and that's largely because, you know, the Catskill Park and Forest Preserve make up a significant portion of the watershed for Ashokan. You can see here protection by basin. Kensico, West Branch, Ashokan, and Rondout are 4 reservoirs that can send water directly into the city under certain configurations. So we have certain levels of protection there that are good. Never Sink, once again, backs up into the park and forest preserve, and we have varying levels of protection at the different reservoirs. This program is not sort of set in stone. It's been fungible over the years. It's been changing over the years. One of the things that's been changing is the natural features criteria that a parcel has to meet in order for us to be able or eligible to purchase it. So nowadays it has to have, yes, I gotta go through some of this, sorry. It's gonna, nowadays it has to be, in plain terms, it has to be steeper and wetter for us to be able to purchase it. That wasn't always the case. Even in the beginning, there was recognition on behalf of the city and the regulators in the towns that certain lands had to be set aside to encourage development and encourage growth. The use of hamlet areas was a tool for that. So in 1993, about 21,000 acres were set aside in 33 towns, and these were areas that were set aside, you know, that really couldn't be solicited for land purchases, and many of them also had services that were being paid for by the city, wastewater services and other things, focusing future development in an area where population centers were with infrastructure was the idea. In 2010, those areas were doubled. So an additional 26,000 acres was added to them. And in the future, we expect that those areas are going to grow again. From 1997 to 2010, the hamlet areas here in Olive expanded from 547 to 1,880 acres. Questions we have, and this will be my last slide. We have a lot of questions about land acquisition, to be honest with you. When have we acquired enough land? That's a question we have. For which types of acquisitions are the future marginal benefits worthwhile? How do we know if we purchase this land that we're going to actually get a water quality benefit out of it? That's a question that we have. With almost 40% of land in permanent protection, we have an ultraviolet treatment facility that is able to disinfect some of these microorganisms that can give you a stomach illness in water. With that online and providing another layer of protection for our consumers, you know, what's the right mix for the various programs we have in the watershed to make sure that the water is adequately protected? Does the ownership of small scattered parcels come at a cost of actually having parcels that are sort of interlinked, right? That abut each other, that are along the streams? And what is the best use of ratepayer money to protect the water supply in the long term? We've spent or committed $2.7 billion to the watershed programs since 1997. And going forward, we want to understand what the best use of that money is. So how are we going to get those answers? Well, as many of you know right now, there's an expert study going on by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and they're taking a look at the entire watershed protection program, including land acquisition, and they're going to provide everyone with some advice on what's the best mix of programs going forward, including for land acquisition. We expect some good recommendations there. We have an intensive water quality monitoring program that allows us to see which programs are actually providing benefits to water quality in the streams that feed the reservoirs. State and federal regulators are certainly going to have a role in weighing in, and of course you. You know, next week, we're going to announce a change to our watershed regulations that was the result of watershed residents coming to us and saying, hey, you know, some of these things are creating a real hardship. Can we take another look at them? And we did, and we're relaxing a lot of them significantly. Last thing I just want to show before I'm done, because this was mentioned. The city's gotten a lot more water efficient over the years. And I know this was one of the things Kate asked me when we met at the coffee shop the other day. And I think a lot of you will find this interesting. Peak demand on New York City's water supply was 1979. It was over 1.5 billion gallons per day. Even as recently as 1990, it was up around 1.5 billion gallons per day. A lot of things were happening around that time. In the city was under fire from regulators for combined sewer overflows. Anyone here know what a combined? So that's when storm water and wastewater are going into your local wastewater plant. And when you get a big rainstorm, the wastewater plant gets overwhelmed with rainwater and it essentially dumps raw sewage into the receiving body of water. The city was under a lot of fire for that in the 1990s and had to come up with a way to manage it. Back then, the city was still billing its water customers based on their road frontage, not the amount of water they used. So, ma'am, if you had a house that was more narrow than mine, you paid less for water. It was sort of an arcane system, right? So back then, the city began to install the first generation of water meters that actually billed people for their consumption instead of their road frontage. And if Mrs. Smith down the road got her running toilet fixed and saved $20 on her water bill, that word began to spread. And of course, around this time also, technology was getting better, low-flow shower heads, low-flow toilets, low-flow washers and dishwashers. This was documented in an episode of Seinfeld. For those of you who are a big fan of that show, you may remember when Kramer got a low-flow shower head installed by his landlord and he couldn't get the shampoo out of his hair anymore, and he had to go on the black market and purchase a old high-flow shower head from some Eastern European gentleman, and it blew him out of the shower. That's actually what was going on. And you can see the city's demand for water has gone down by about 35% since 1990, even as the population of the city has gone up by 1.5 million people. That's a trend that we see continuing, and we don't see any trend in the future, population-wise, development-wise, water use-wise, that's really going to change from that baseline of about 1 billion gallons per day for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Adam. Turn the lights up again so you can see our guests. Somewhat, anyway. Okay, why don't you come a little closer here? Okay. And I would just, for the record, Mr. Bosch took 4 extra minutes, and we're going to.
Sorry.
Bye, you guys. Thanks for coming. See you soon. See you, Adam. No, I'm just kidding. We knew they had to leave.
Bored her right into leaving.
Nah, it's great. I really appreciate all the presenters. Are they amazing? That's why I want to have them. I'm going to ask a few questions. April, what in particular concerns you about the DEP land that's already been acquired, and have you seen this pattern before in your research? I guess you told us already that you have, but what historic sites have you uncovered in Olive, and what's the value in preserving them in your mind?
So, should I take the mic or
Yeah,
leave it there?
Take it, because I don't think you can. Can you reach that? Okay.
So the sites that I registered with the State Historic Preservation Office are the Yale Quarry on Acorn Hill, and they're putting in a new trail that Marcus Heidelberg and I hiked earlier this week, which does not include all the ruins that are on that property. All of the building foundations and original roads that are on the Ashokan North and the Bushkill and Sandhill properties, which I don't have access to because I am not fishing and hunting, and I don't pretend to be fishing and hunting when I do my work. But I have registered those using satellite imagery with the state, and there's about 20 building foundations on those properties that are now going to be exposed potentially to more access with the rail trail, and also with the changes that might be coming to Boyceville. And I'm kind of curious if there's going to be a new former site of Boyceville sign that's going up. The Black Road property, it has the remains of a farm that some of you might know whose farm it was. I can't figure out whose farm it was.
The chases are here, perhaps they'll shed some light on that.
Yeah. Peck Road has a cemetery, a building foundation, and clearly a dairy farm that used to be on it. And then the farm that I showed the picture on the South Mountain, the Wispel portion of South Mountain. I've asked the owners of the Watson Hollow house if I could excavate there, and they're still pondering. And there's a 1858 schoolhouse site on High Point Mountain Road that disappeared before the reservoir came in, and I haven't been able to find any information about that. But the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, has given me permission to do a survey on the Estelina property that is part of the Slide Mountain wilderness. And everybody keeps telling me about this bear trap that's...
I can take you there. After
Yeah, well, I do not trespass, so I do not have a hunting or fishing license.
Oh, but I do. I can point to you from the road. The problem is there's a bunch of trees over it now. That's why your LiDAR isn't working on it.
But I think it's important that everybody knows that I do not trespass. And one of the problems that I've had surveying these properties is it's really hard to not trespass because they're not very well marked. It's hard to figure out when you're crossing onto somebody's land. But for the historic building surveys that Kate brought up, a historic district, so I had one of my students do this up. In West Ashokan and Ashokan, the highest priority land acquisition areas, those purple and oranges, are where your houses are, right? And that's where the last of the old parts of those areas are. So in West Ashokan, there are only, according to my ability to do this with tax records and maps, there are only 16 buildings that predate 1915 that are still standing. And in the Ashokan area, there are 15 buildings before 1915 that still stand, and some of those are closer up to Woodstock because that was less impacted. And everybody keeps telling me about all the moved buildings, and I've only been able to identify 3 buildings that might have been moved. So there's possibly less than 30 buildings left of old olive around the reservoir in those very high priority areas. Some of those houses are currently abandoned. I'm sure some of those will wind up uninhabitable, and then they become vacant land that the city can purchase. And those properties aren't being documented. So I'm not trying to stop anybody from selling a property if they want to sell it. I would just like an opportunity to document what is there and make sure that records of these places wind up in the local history museum downstairs.
Well, how difficult would it be to create a historic district or a historic trail in town of Olive? I mean, what are the steps? And really, it's only just one. Oh, we got a packet of paper here.
I have
no, but I mean, we talked the other
options.
day, and Adam was. You were saying, I said, what's the holdup? And you said that you can't get on the property till after the city has acquired it. And so we were talking about, is there a way that there can be a little pause between the city buying a property and you getting a chance, or some archaeological folks get in there and sort of document things?
All of this is up to the landowners. We can't list anybody's house on a national register without their permission. So we can, my student and I could send letters to all the people who own these houses and ask for permission. I have very bad response rates on my letters, other than Kate.
You need an insider.
But I'm persistent. But hopefully some of these people who have these buildings, like I'm not sure what's going on at the Broadhead School, but it was just painted last week. That is one of the only it's the only clearly identifiable schoolhouse in all of Olive, and 8 of them were demolished to create the reservoir. And I suspect that it's actually pieces of different old buildings that were demolished to create the reservoir, that place has a lot of story to tell. Clearly somebody's renovating it, so the inside has recently been changed, which makes it harder for me to document. So it's just stages, so I could get the State Historic Preservation Office to start reviewing this and working with us, but we need willing landowners.
There needs to be a will for this, and we'll find that out later if there is that. Thank you. LeAnne, if you don't mind passing that. In your opinion, what's been the greatest loss in Olive, and what significance does an urban normative culture have when considering rural life in general, but in Olive in particular?
So I have colleagues at Oneonta, Alex Thomas and Greg Fulkerson, and I want to recognize them. They've done a lot of work around the area of something called urban normativity, which is a theoretical framework that actually April talked about earlier, which is sort of in a nutshell, it's the urban is the norm to which we all strive to be, that is the end-all answer to solve problems, without the recognition for years and years and years that the only reason cities exist and survive is because they depend on extraction from rural areas. And I'm not going to call energy development. I'm going to call it what it is, extraction. So it's extraction, whether it's water, whether it's reliance upon food. If it's reliance upon water, it could be fuels, different types of fuels depending on the area. So an urban normative, which I call privilege, is as an expectation that when the city grows and it has needs, that it will take from, as my colleagues say, the hinterlands of rural areas. So my point, what is lost is, as April just articulately said, we have buildings, we have sites, historical sites, and some people may say, well, we need to move on. But my argument is, as I tried to say in the presentation I had, it's more than a building or a site. It includes a history, it includes memories, it includes people, it includes knowledge. And those are really strong connections. So when things are lost, and part of me documenting my mom's cohort and that knowledge, is when those people go, a vast amount of knowledge is gone. And so it's not just people, it's place, it's buildings, but it's very much entangled, and I mean that in a really good way. The roots run very deep. And when these places are lost, it's more than just physical space that's lost.
Thanks, LeAnne. Adam, even though the land acquisition program is clearly willing buyer, willing seller scenario, was there any acknowledgement that the program might provoke old feelings among some residents because of the echo of past land acquisitions in the town of Olive? Basically, I'm asking if the DEP understood that this might open an old wound.
Yeah, there was, and I'd say increasingly so. So when the land acquisition program was first set up, other than willing seller, willing buyer, one of the other core tenets of it was having solicitation targets, not acquisition targets. So just to be clear on that difference, the difference was that our regulators said to us, you have to solicit a certain number of acres each year. You don't have to acquire a certain number of acres each year. And the concern there was clearly, if the city had targets that said, hey, you have to acquire X number of acres, there would be additional fear that the city would go to some other means to make sure it hit that target. So solicitation targets was really one of the key parts of that. And I'd say, going forward, on that one chart I mentioned, there's a lot of other mechanisms that we're using now other than just buying land outright. And I think the streamside acquisition program is the latest of them to say, hey, we might not need this whole parcel, of which the rest of the land could be in active farming or something like that, or it could be someone's home. But it would be really good to preserve a 200-foot buffer along this stream that we know just a few miles down the road, is either going into the reservoir or into a bigger river that ultimately feeds the reservoir. So there was thinking about that from the beginning, and I would say that the thinking on that continues to evolve and get better over time.
Okay, thank you, Adam. April, I'm going to go off script here a little bit, and God help us all, I'm going off script. I was interested in the one slide you had. It kind of referred to almost like an old playbook that happens, a cycle that happens, a water issue, and then, can you speak just a little bit about that and what your concerns are? Or in light of the really balanced kind of presentations we've gotten today, in my estimations, when I'm listening to or watching Adam's presentation, it all looks like water preservation and makes sense to me at this point. Can you help speak to the other side of that?
Well, that's the whole point. They have to make it make sense, or you wouldn't do it, right?
Okay.
I don't think there's an accident that they acquired most of their land during a recession, right? I think that shows that it's not a willing seller. It's people who are being pushed. So I go all the way back to Manhattan, and the first water supply in Manhattan was the collect pond that was where Wall Street is, right on the outside of Wall Street. And that was completely contaminated by 1776. And they filled it in, and there were slums on top of it and a prison that was called the Tombs because it was always moldy in there because it was basically on top of the water source. And so they built the Croton Dam and the receiving reservoir. They had to build Central Park to create the receiving reservoir. And they destroyed two communities, Seneca Hill and Yorkville, which were immigrant and free African communities, and they said it was for the greater good. So they demolished those people, pushed them off their land, they lost their land. And then the Croton Dam breaks, and people get flooded out, and they build a new Croton Dam, and they said it was for the greater good. And then they go up to the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, and they take that land. And as soon as they take the land in Kent for the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, there's a drought. So they start taking all of the local lakes. And then they demolish an entire community called Farmers Mills, because Farmers Mills was between White Pond, that was spring-fed, and the Boyd's Corner Reservoir. And when they were doing that, they said, this will give us enough water forever. And as soon as they're done building the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, they start buying the land or making the decision to buy the land for the Ashokan Reservoir. So if you read the documents over and over, they make the same argument that we have enough water if we do this, and everything will be fine if we do this. And then within a generation, enough time for people to forget and people to fall in love with the reservoir, right? At the Boyd's Corner Reservoir, they said, oh, we have to fix the dam, so we're going to have to drain the reservoir to fix the dam. And they left the reservoir empty for 10 years. And the town had become so dependent on their reservoir that they had to sue the city to get the city to refill the reservoir after they built the dam. And what are they about to do at the Ashokan? They're about to strengthen the dam. Right? So this same, if you study the 150 years, it's over and over again. And if you study community to community across the world, the same thing happens. Water is power. And governments legitimize themselves by providing fresh, clean water. But who are they providing the fresh, clean water to? And why aren't they paying you guys for your water?
Thank you. And I'm going to actually go let Adam speak to that for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to go. Do you have a question for April?
I just had a comment, but the playbook. I was going to mention the playbook. But
Let him speak, and then we're going to go to you. Okay.
Yeah, the last time the city looked at, well, it's actually, there's a really interesting example of what April was talking about here at Ashokan Reservoir in 1913 when the gates on the Olive Bridge Dam were closed. There's a great headline in the New York Times that said, Esopus Dam closed, water famine now impossible. And 20 years later, to almost that exact date, it said, city running out of water, looking for new sources. And that was the foray that they went out to build Rondout and Neversink and Papacton, and Kansville was a whole other issue. But certainly she's right on those. And the last time the city actually even took a look at expanding its water supply was after the drought of, was it 84, 85 or 85, 86? And that was when, some of you may remember, there was that great picture in the New York Times of Ed Koch standing in an almost empty Ashokan Reservoir praying. I don't know if you remember that. It was sort of a funny photo that floats around from time to time. But back then, they put together a commission because if you think about that chart I showed, they were projecting that this year the demand on New York City's water supply was going to be 2.2 billion gallons per day. And so they had that in mind, and they looked at a lot of interesting things. They looked at putting a pumping station in Red Hook on the Hudson River and pumping that water from Red Hook down into a facility that we have in southern Dutchess County. They looked into some way to skim water off the top of the Great Lakes. I mean, they were looking at all sorts of wacky and nearly impossible things. You're right, our focus has been on conservation. More recently, technology, as I mentioned, has really helped. The project that April alluded to here at Ashokan Reservoir is one that we announced a few years ago, the Ashokan Century Program. Since the 1990s, we've been going reservoir by reservoir by reservoir and upgrading the dams and intake structures, because after 100 years, not everything is as good as new anymore, and you do need to go and refurbish things. So the Ashokan Century Program, which will start 2023 or thereabouts, is a $1 billion project to upgrade all the stuff here at Ashokan Reservoir. And it costs so much because here at Ashokan Reservoir, guess what? We have more stuff here than any other of the 19 reservoirs in the whole system. There's 29,000 linear feet of dam here at Ashokan. That's more than all the other 18 reservoirs combined. There's 3 intake chambers that work in series where most of the reservoirs only have 1. So there's just a lot of infrastructure here that needs to be maintained. We're about 10% into that design at this point for some of those projects, which means essentially we haven't done anything yet other than sit around and talk about some basics. So more to come on that.
Okay, and LeAnne, you had a comment on April's comments. Thanks, Adam.
Could I ask the person in the back to pull a slideshow up again? I'm sorry, if you can. It is mine, if you can get to it. If
LeAnne
it's-
Avery is the one we're looking for.
Yep. Keep, let's see, this one right here. This slide, please. I'm used to being out in schools where you touch these and boom. Okay, we can leave it. So I refer to this, April, again, mentioned over, say, 150 years, and I'm going to go back a little further and say the playbook, I call it the playbook, without an expletive yet. The playbook.
There's no swearing today, LeAnne.
Okay. So the playbook. And I want to start by saying and recognizing, I said before, my family's been here for generations and generations and generations, yet we, those of us that first came many, many years ago, we engaged in the playbook ourselves, and we took the land from the Lenape, whose land we are on right now. And I just want to recognize this was their land first. And then we continue the playbook of colonization. And as April was describing, we have, non-Indigenous people took from Indigenous people. Non-Indigenous people take from non-Indigenous people. And it continues. So I applied the playbook to looking at old documentation, articles from the New York Times, Spooky Ulster, Ulster Aboriginals. We are Rubens of the First Order, at least I am, evidently.
Yes, LeAnne and I are Aboriginals, actually, and I like that.
But I applied the playbook, and to April's point, it's happening over and over and over again. And when do we stop? We need a new playbook. We need to throw a playbook out and figure out how, and we have hard conversations, and there is trauma, and there is resentment, and there is concern, and you hear it in our voices, and we have a history, but the point is the playbook continues, and how do we get rid of that playbook and look for, and something we'll talk about later, the common interest or common values. But I want to point out to you, this has been happening worldwide for years, and it has happened here with the building of the Ashokan Reservoir and others, and it's continuing. It just may have a different name.
No, keep that mic. I'm going to ask you another question, and that is something I wanted to keep. I mention it every other time I'm speaking about this, but we know that this isn't the only story, but this is our story. It's personal and it's local, but it's also universal. This has been going on forever, and it happens all the time. So we're aware of that. LeAnne, what guiding principles could be adopted by residents, governing bodies, and neighboring entities that might make a difference going forward? So what's an example of a new playbook? And I would give that to you, and then back to April, and then we'll give it over to Adam.
Well, like I said, I think, and we've talked about this when we ran into each other on the reservoir walking, actually. And it's a place I love and spent many years running when I was young, and now I bike because it's kinder. But it is a beautiful space. It really is a beautiful, beautiful space. But I think it starts with recognizing the past. And no, we don't need to stay there, but we need to recognize it and understand the complexity and the disruption that did happen. And it does get past those traumatic feelings from generation to generation. There is, if you can bring the slideshow back up, I had one where it's a quote from the New York Times. It was actually from former owners of the Winchell's Pizza. But basically it was sort of like, what is it with the old timers? It's like it's in their blood. They just hate city people. Like, well, yes and no. So what do I want to say about that is, yeah, there is resentment, there is concern, there is past trauma, but to move forward into new places, we have to recognize that did happen. And sometimes it's hard conversations, and sometimes they're unpleasant. But if you ask what's a new playbook, recognizing it, and now how do we move forward together and to look for what are the common values? All of us want clean water and to preserve some of the land potentially. So what are the common values? But to find those, I think we have to acknowledge what each person or entity brings to the field.
All right, thank you. And would you hand that over to April? And I'll let you kick that one too. Thanks, April.
I think the strategy of buying parcels one by one from each individual seller makes it that it's individual's choice how the town of Olive is going to be in the next 100 years. And that's why I like the idea of at least putting together a proposal for a historic district and having some town meetings and see what the town themselves want to protect and preserve. That it shouldn't be, well, I could really use $10,000, I could really use $50,000, what the heck, versus, okay, this is the place on our landscape that holds our stories, that we're gonna tell our children about, and that we don't want everything to be one of those modern shack things that, moving in all of the newer development that's coming in. Like, what do you need before Olive is no longer Olive to have saved?
So that's the name of the game here. And so I'm going to actually, I realize that we're a little bit behind. And so do you have a great need to say anything? No. Okay, great. Well, I'm just trying to be fair. We're very lucky that we have a concerned citizenry, but we also have a great town board. And Jimmy Safranco's here, but also Helen Chase is here, who served on our town board. And Drew Bodges, is he here? Hi, Drew. So we have people who are, hi, Scotty's here, and then we have someone elect back there, Mr. Edinger, and Tim Cox. Well, anyway, we have a lot of great people here. And so maybe, I don't know, I'd like to start the party off by saying, is there a will for the town? Is there any need for a historical district? I mean, I think it'd be a great thing just to designate some places, to work with our friends our new friends at the DEP, to try to get there and to get them designated. And Helen Chase, you worked really, really hard you almost had a check in your hand, didn't you, from one entity to buy us a building, and then that didn't go so well. Can you speak to that? I mean, Helen, by the way, pays a monthly fee to store artifacts because we don't have a museum. I mean, we have the small room downstairs, but she's carrying the load by herself. And I'd like to get us some property so we can create a beautiful museum to the lost towns, perhaps, or even to the vital industry that's taken over the town of Olive since 1915, which has been illustrious. So why don't you stand up and talk to us? Would you like a mic? How about a mic? Come on up here. Everybody's on a 5-minute thing, though. Why don't you go grab that one? This is Helen Chase.
I am supposed to be and have been elected as for 15 years now the president of the Historical Society of the Town of Olive. We don't have a structure. I am storing items that have been given to the Historical Society through the many years. Helen Jeffs and LeAnne have given some of their things to the Historical Society, and I store them because we don't have a place to put them. One of the places that I have hoped that we might acquire, if we had a Capitol Drive, there's a home that stands empty, and it has stood empty for a number of years. Chet Lyons.
Yeah, crossing the rail trail.
Right across from the rail trail. The home is 3 stories. It has a large yard, and it is a perfect home. I'm not so sure it's a perfect museum.
Yeah.
But it has a very large yard for adequate parking, and it would be a kernel for an historic district. The general store, the lavender building that's there at the corner of the Berry Patch, corner of Mountain Road and Route 28, stands empty, and it's been empty for quite a while. There's a series of about 10 buildings along that, by that intersection of Mountain Road, both sides, that could be the beginning of an historic district. You had another question that I was going to respond to, and I can't remember what it was. But I'll think of it.
Yeah, thanks for your input. I mean, April has designated a lot of things that we might want to preserve. And I'm actually going to ask Adam, now that the city owns certain parcels of land, is it possible, if known sites exist, that the DEP might grant access to preserve designated historical or cultural sites?
Yeah, I think we
Okay.
We had talked about this when we had gotten together, and I don't see any reason why we wouldn't grant access to document things that are there. That's
Okay,
my
great.
short answer.
That's what we were looking for. Thank you. Let me just say, as the DEP land acquisition program evolves, do you think the DEP, Board of Water Supply, has acquired enough land? I guess you answered some of those questions that you have a question. But I want to ask this question. He answered it for me, but I wanted to get this out into the world. Has expansion of the reservoir ever been an end game for the DEP?
No.
Okay,
No.
that was another really good, that's too
No,
long.
I mean, it's never been talked about. It's not needed. We don't like to spend money that we don't need to spend. It would be a waste of ratepayer money at this point. I do want to just provide one other sort of take on land acquisition program, and this is a little bit of a wonky thing, but try to follow me here. When our regulators say for the land acquisition program that we have to solicit X amount of acres over the next 10 years, one of the strange budgeting things that we have to do is we have to set aside enough money as though we were going to buy all that land. And ultimately, we don't end up buying all that land, but we still have to set aside the money. And guess what? That's money that we could otherwise use for
A
upgrading dams.
natatorium in a town of Olive, a big, beautiful building like they have up in Roxbury, with 6 lanes, an exercise room, a conveniently located meeting room. I have some plans. I just think it'd be great for the DEP to provide something that was taken from us. There was a beautiful athletic society down under the reservoir that no longer exists, and I think the town of Olive needs a place to recreate, and I think the DEP would be a perfect way to fund that.
Let me finish my thought. Is this where it turns into 40 on 1? Okay. But what I was saying was we have to set aside enough money as that we're going to do all that. That's money that could otherwise go toward things like
The natatorium
upgrading
with 5 lanes.
aqueducts, upgrading dams, upgrading things that are in dire need of upgrade. And so one of the reasons we've asked the National Academies, which has a sort of a very closed process, but they have a lot of smart people on that panel, to take a look at these programs and land acquisition being among them, is if we can sort of dial some of that back and reapportion that, sort of allocate that money toward things that we know we need to make sure the water supply, it gets operated, maintained, and protected well in the future, that would be good for the overall system.
Well-being, yeah.
So it's a different way to think of it, but we don't like having all that money locked up in land
We
acquisition.
can help you
and
spend it,
we
Adam.
would
I'm
like
telling
to,
you. I
Yeah,
got a
no,
plan.
listen, I mean, we'll be spending $1 billion of it here in the next 15
What's
years.
another
so.
900,000 is what I
Exactly.
say, so thank you. This would be a great time to open the floor for any questions you have. We have this beautiful panel here. Would you stand up, say your name, and speak as loud as you can?
One question I have is, I understand that the activities, the DEP and the New York City Watershed Corporation, that there's a need to have clean, safe water for residents in that area. What I don't understand is how you make the connection between that need and the solution being to displace people, or what you call land acquisition, because the people that work here originally owned the land, right? Mm-hmm. They did.
Yeah.
And we're in a free market economy, which is really based on acknowledging and protecting property rights, right? So why aren't you paying rent to the people that live here? This should be one of the wealthiest areas in New York, shouldn't it? I mean, I just don't understand.
I'm not going to pretend like I have a great answer to that question.
But you're part of the conversations about this, right?
The nature of New York City's ownership of the reservoirs and the riparian areas of which they are a part dates back to a state law that was passed in 1905 that set all that up. And you could probably spend a whole day just reading that law and talking about that law. But there was essentially a law passed 1905 called the McClellan Act, later referred to as the Water Supply Act of 1905, that did a number of things. It gave the city the authority to use eminent domain procedure law to forcibly purchase the lands that it needed to build the reservoirs, dams, aqueducts, all that sort of stuff. It also did a couple of other interesting things. It required 2 forms of public access to the reservoirs forever: fishing and ice harvesting.
It also, the whole point of the McClellan Act, if you don't mind me
Right, go ahead.
interjecting, was not about eminent domain, but about protecting citizens. And a huge part of that act was to protect citizens from what happened at the Croton Reservoir. The citizens were treated poorly. Their land was taken by eminent domain, and McClellan was actually a good guy, put this act together so that it should never happen again. He said, not that it wouldn't be, that properties might not be seized, but they would be treated fairly. That's what the McClellan Act was about, to protect. And then the very thing happened in 1905 to 1912, during the clearing of the Esopus Valley. The McClellan Act was basically disregarded, and that's actually a fact. LeAnne?
You said what I was going to say, which
She could have
was
said it
fair.
better.
Yeah, no, you said it beautifully. Those fair market value was not given. So if you go to the historical records, less than 25% of people actually got value for their properties. Most people died before they got them, or got less, substantially less than anything that was worth. I would invite you to look at the takings hearings, the original documents,
They're really
because
interesting.
it's a very condescending discourse that takes place from the lawyers from New York City versus. You can see Mr. Clearwater. There's a
Big
sign in the
hero.
museum downstairs who did advocate for the citizens that were displaced.
And you guys would know this better than me, but what was it, the first branch of the state Supreme Court, or there was the first branch of some arm of New York State courts was set up in Kingston to deal just with all of that.
They certainly were on
So,
Wall
I
Street.
mean, but
There's
the
a-
current day land acquisition program, I mean, I would hesitate to compare it in that way to what was, it's not the same.
But it feels like it.
I will charge you rent to access the land, to do what you need to do to protect the water.
Right.
Is that?
That's kind of what our conservation easements,
But it's ownership, though, it's what you're after, right?
So there's 2 different things. One is the
Yeah.
Land Acquisition Program, LAP, and the other is Conservation Easement, CE, and they are different programs.
yeah, they're cousin programs essentially, yeah. That's
Thanks for
right.
your question. So downstairs,
Can I just add?
yeah, sure.
A demand of 2.1 billion.
That was back in the 80s, that projection, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And the projection, or the actual
Yeah.
demand has been declining, especially
Right.
since the metered use.
Yeah, went in the opposite direction, essentially. Yep.
So we're actually about $500 million per day less in consumption.
Half a billion gallons,
from
right?
where we were
Yep.
like 10 years ago.
29 years ago, yeah, 30 years ago.
But you own more land than you did then.
Right.
I don't understand the math, because you said we don't know how much land we need. I don't even understand, like, why would you buy land if you don't even know if you need it?
To be blunt, the goal of the land acquisition program was to essentially prevent development on properties that were wet or steep and would have a potential impact on water quality going in the streams, creeks, and rivers that feed the reservoir system.
It was an environmental situation. I think that what they would say is that they're trying to protect what they have, which I think we all agree is a good idea. It's just the way it's working out that has that past echo, which is why we're having the panel. Thanks for your comments. Was another? Oh, hi. Right over here in the front row, and then we'll go back to Helen.
One comment and possibly one question
Sure.
to DEP.
Yeah.
My first comment is, we have to remember New York City is the economic engine of the world. Number 2, New York City contributes the greatest to every single resident in this state. So when you talk about paying taxes, we can't forget, and what they do now is they're the greatest contributor to the wealth, health, and welfare to every resident in the state of New York. What I wanted to mention to DEP, you're talking about steep, deep, and wetlands, to protect. They're valuable. I'm not too sure if you're aware that 1 mile east of the eastern portion of the Ashokan Reservoir, we have a very steep, deep, and extremely large wetland that goes from the town of Kingston into the town of Hurley. It goes through the Premier Brook into the Esopus Creek, which then drains into the Hudson River. Right now, we're facing a great danger of concrete washout, which is like sending Drano right down into these communities.
Are you talking about that precast concrete place?
Precast concrete.
It's not in the watershed. We don't get involved in things like that. That's not in the watershed.
It's a mile away, but that was my comment.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Helen?
I have a message on my phone, which I've been keeping because it's so interesting. There's a woman that contacted me about a month ago to find out if I knew how she could find information about what her ancestor received from the city. And I forwarded her to Nina Postupak,
Who's the Ulster County Clerk?
Ulster County Clerk. She has records that go back into the history. And she was, the woman who was questioning it, found that she was able to find what she needed. And her ancestor had barns, outbuildings, houses, cattle, animals, just a wonderful spring, water source. And his appraised value was $17,000, which was a lot at that point. But what she found that he was ultimately paid was based on a census, the previous census, and not the current census. But what he received was $850.
Yeah, and if you want to know more about this, thank you, Helen. Some residents did very well, I want to say that. Also, I want you to know that some residents were actually from New York City. They were second homeowners. That was going on back then. So this is not us and them. This is all of us. We are you. The other thing is all of that information is down at the Hall of Records on Foxhall Avenue, and it is really interesting reading. This is the kind of stuff we were talking about. Those old injuries, that mistreatment is why sometimes these conversations are piqued and there's a mistrust. I was hoping to have someone like Adam and April and LeAnne here so we could get it on the table. It's not going to go away unless we talk about it. That sort of payout, it was very common, as a matter of fact. So, are there any other comments? Oh, sorry, yep.
This is just a comment from an elderly person. Very. And I have been cleaning my house because it's time, right? And I have found things from way back, you know, like children's notebooks, a Mother's Day card, all that kind of beautiful, loving, sentimental, memory kind of laden object. Now, I get the feeling that, what do I do now? Do I keep it forever? Well, forever is almost here. Or do I just keep the memory and throw it out? I mean, how much can I keep that's really, really, really relevant to me, to the world, to the community, and to the world, to anybody? So I think there is a kind of a romantic, valid recollection of things that used to be that maybe we should just hang on to the meaning of it and not make it like a holy object, which in a way it is to us, but not really, really. And I get the feeling that we are in a way self-torturing when we say my ancestors had the farm and the cows and the cattle and the schoolhouse and the old things. That was, I mean, my kids' notebooks was, and doesn't make them less valuable to me, but is it worth hanging on to, really? Because, you know, it's just there, and then time goes, and it's no longer there, and it doesn't really matter. So,
Thanks for your insight on that.
yeah.
That's why we're here today, is this is how it started. Is like, I kept saying, why am I hanging on to this? Why am I hanging on to different articles? I live in an ancestral home. I can't part with certain things. If it has my grandmother's handwriting on it, I don't want to let it go, right? And I kept saying, why is it I'm like that? I'm not that crazy. What's with me? Debatable, I suppose. And that's when I started looking into, well, of course I'm hanging on to everything. People that I had just a generation or two, 3 generations ago, lost everything. And I think that that's what it was. I'm really, really wanting to let this go. And that's why I'm having these kind of discussions as often as possible to try to get to that place. I'm not interested in the long ago as much as I am interested in having a peaceable present and a future that involves getting along really easily with people I come in contact with. And it's a philosophical thing. Jack, did you have a...
My name is Jack Conroy. I'm a newcomer to Olive, too. I've been here only 30 years now. So. And in my defense, I did not come here from New York City. I came here after discovering that I was in the same situation. I came from a farm, and I only wanted to be a farmer for most of my childhood. Until I discovered that the farmers in my area were growing houses. So right now, the family farm for many generations is in the bedroom community of Baltimore, Washington. So I get a sense, okay? One of the things that happened to me as I moved in here, I went to the post office in Olive Bridge, the old post office.
And Shirley and Jeanette.
Yeah. And as I was trying to establish myself as a resident, I'm talking to the...
And
anyway,
Shirley.
right behind me is Eleanor Boyce.
Oh, wow.
And she taps me on the shoulder, and she says, she already knew this somehow. Do you realize that you're one of those people who is taking the land in Olive Bridge? So I'm on a plot of land that was a farm. It was divided up. And it gave me a great bit of heartache to think about that. That this land, which had produced all this food and wealth for people for several generations, is now cut up into 10 or 12 parcels. And I enjoy it there. I like it. I like it a lot. But one of the things that Eleanor and I talked about, we got to know each other for a while. She started dragging me into all kinds of things I never thought about I'd get into. But she said, you know, everybody who moves here wants to be the last person to move here.
That's right. Close the gate behind you.
Huh?
Close the gate behind you.
Close the gate behind you, yeah. But then when, Kate, you're talking about a historic district, I start thinking about something called a comprehensive plan. And so I want to talk to Jim and Dave and Drew and other people who have been selected by us to lead us, to really think about a comprehensive plan that would incorporate these districts, but sorry, it gets me.
Yeah, me too.
Also keep our character of a rural community that comes together like this.
How do we prevent our town from becoming an overly affluent community? Like, I think, April, did it happen in Kent? And they outlawed farming, I believe?
Yeah, in 1899, New York State outlawed any farm within 1,000 feet of a water body that would flow into any water body that would flow into a reservoir that would flow into the city. So all the property values in Kent plummeted, and all of the urban people came up to be able to have commuting. So it became Kent right now. Everybody could go to Kent. I'm not keeping you from Kent. Kent is just subdivisions and lakes that feed those subdivisions as private water supplies. There's no town center, there's no commerce, and most people in Kent don't know that they live in Kent. they think they live in Carmel because that's where the town center is. The Historical Society is pretty much a genealogy group that talks about the Revolutionary War. Nothing has happened in Kent since the Revolutionary War, and there are all of these farm buildings in the woods that they believe are from aliens or Native Americans, and they want me to stop doing what I'm doing so I could study the aliens and Native Americans. And I teach Native American culture. Native Americans did not make buildings like that just conveniently next to a stone wall. Like the context and association of archaeologists. And Kent is, I was telling this to Jim and Marty's the other day, Kent is 50 years in the future because it started in 1867. And I see Olive becoming Kent, where it's going to be lots of nice houses that are separated from each other by lots of forest, and only the wealthy people can afford to stay, and there will be no place for anybody to learn what was here before, and people forget. Everybody in Kent thinks that it's all virgin forest. If you go to any of the subdivision websites, it says you could own land in virgin forest. And I have the maps, I have the ruins, it's not virgin forest. And they're very confused to the point that one of the people from the Historical Society said, I forgot to put all the lakes on the old map. Those lakes weren't there.
Wow. So how do we prevent what happened to Kent from happening here is I think what Jeanette is asking.
Get rid of the rail trail.
Oh, geez, here we go.
It's a big mistake.
Well,
Jeanette?
for instance, I know we've kind of lost half of Boyceville.
Right. Well, that's my next question.
Our commercial property is kind of shrinking, and young entrepreneurs really don't have a place to open up shop, at least in the Boyceville area. And the other thing about historical buildings, at least in Boyceville, there is, the old schoolhouse that was only built about the time the Reservoir was built, but I think it's one of the ones that's been acquired or will be. And I'm wondering, will it be torn down, or will the city allow someone to purchase it and relocate it?
They're in the town of Boyceville, in the little hamlet here. Mrs. Shealy's, the old schoolhouse is there. It's one of the properties that's been acquired, and we're wondering if we can have it, so we can keep it, so we can put it somewhere and do something cool with it.
The city acquired the old schoolhouse?
I think so. It's already gone?
They did.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah. I don't know.
Who should we ask?
I can ask someone for it.
Yeah, no, that's seriously what we're here for, is because the next conversation is about Boyceville, and I don't know why I've been avoiding it, but I mean, it's the kind of stuff that here we are again, and I know we spoke about it the other day. Maybe can you field a couple of questions about Boyceville?
I got to be honest with you, this is one of the topics that I don't know a ton about. I mean, if it's related to the local flood
Maybe
analysis and that stuff, I think that's being a little driven more on the local level.
Does anybody have a direct question about Boyceville and what's going on in Boyceville? And maybe Jimmy can pipe in if it...
I'm driving west on 28,
Right.
and it talks about building some kind of a dam.
Right.
Oh,
I'm on the town board for 6 years. I'm on the board of Catskill Watershed Corporation as well. Thank you. And on the town board, when I got on 6 years ago, we started looking at the flooding issues in the area, in the town, and especially in the hamlets. And Boyceville was a #1 priority because of the flooding that's received in Boyceville. As a result of that, Sylvia had acquired funding to have a local flood analysis done, and that took several years. Some of the members of the flood analysis board are here. And what we did was we looked at it, and we looked at we did hydrological studies with an engineering firm, and we looked at what's happening there and what we can do there and what our options are. And what it came down to is that there are many buildings in the 100-year floodplain. And the 100-year floodplain includes the IGA, it goes across 28 to the medical building there, to that Judy Gerard's place we were talking about, the little schoolhouse. And when we did the analysis, we looked at all of that, and we realized that every one of those buildings has a unique circumstance from the perspective of a unique owner, depending on the age, a unique financial situation, whether there's a big mortgage or they own it outright, and a unique hydrological situation and how to best mitigate that. And what the town did is we looked at those properties and we had in the flood analysis options for everything. And what we did in Boyceville was, one of the options was a berm. And when we looked at the berm, we did some cost projections over and above what the analysis had said. And we looked at a berm that would, in that report, I think it was 3.9 million. And I think we looked at it, it was more like going to be anywhere from 8 to 10 million when we looked at other comparable berms and the costs associated with them. And when we started looking at that from a cost analysis, compared to what we were saving for the money it would cost, it didn't become economically feasible for the town to do that. There was annual maintenance costs. So what we had was options of using programs through the Catskill Watershed Corporation of flood mitigation, which means you can study your building, you can raise all of your utilities up to, I believe it's 2 feet above the 100-year floodplain, and you can mitigate it by raising buildings. But just to give you a sense of what it is like in Boyceville, the firehouse in Boyceville, the flooding for the 100-year floodplain is 8.5 feet high. So it's almost unfeasible for most of those properties to sustain, to stay there and be there. And the overriding, compelling factor in all of that is the flood insurance. So if you have a mortgage, a commercial mortgage on a property, a private property, commercial property, through a bank, you need to have flood insurance. And the flood insurance in Boyceville, the rates went up from 2015 to 2017, 35%, just in that short little time. Every year they were projected to go up between 15 and 33%. So it became obvious that it was really hard to, quote unquote, save Boyceville. So what we did was we looked at the analysis and we offered properties that were within that 100-year floodplain the option to partake in the New York City buyout program. Some of these people were very close to bankruptcy and sustaining, I know the florist was, he had a job at Target working the cash register just so he could keep his store there and keep it open. So it was either go bankrupt or sell to New York City for many of these people. So we allowed certain properties, I think there were 7 properties that we've allowed to entertain that option, and you need a willing buyer from the city, a willing seller from the property, and the town has to be willing to allow that to happen. And we allowed it to happen in those properties because we didn't see a way that it could sustain itself. Some properties are buying out, some properties have the option to just do nothing and stay. The Boyceville market doesn't seem to like they're just gonna stay there. And that's an option. They can take the hit, they can pay for the flood damage. That's their option as well.
So where does DEP stand on a store like that staying in terms of environmental hazards? Like if so another flood comes and their stuff ends up down in the reservoir, what's the stance there? When does it become mandatory, Jim? Let's put the cards on the table.
There is no mandatory. There is no mandatory. The only thing that we offer through the CWC is the gas tank anchoring to keep the gas tanks from going down into the reservoir.
Yes.
So,
sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did the city pay fair market value for those properties?
They pay market value when they buy those, and they don't pay market value of a property in a floodplain. They pay market value on comps outside of the floodplain.
Was the city the only willing buyer?
The properties have been on the market for years, most of them.
How is that market value? Market value must have been less than what the city paid.
You'd have to look at each one of those.
You get 2 assessments for every purchase.
Well, this one's a little different. I don't know all the details in this one because now we're getting deep into a specialized program that I don't know a ton about. But I know, for instance, if let's say it's a home that's really close to a creek, and this isn't an Olive example, but this is a general example, and it's been flooded time and time and time again. The market value of that is X. We pay based on the comps, which is usually as if it were never flooded and it were a house not in the floodplain. So, that's the way we're required to run this particular program.
Yeah, that was my understanding of those properties. So, what you have is you have properties, I'll use the IGA as an example, that are big commercial properties and ongoing businesses. They have the option of selling to the New York City buyout for a comp price, for a market price. They have a program through the CWC that they can have land purchased for them to move to. But the thing that they don't have is the money to build.
Yeah.
And that is the difficult factor. In particular, when you look at a property like the IGA, the square footage of that supermarket is not they will give you the money to build, the CWC will give you the money to build on a piece of property to build the same size building. When you build that same size building, that's not an attractive building for other people to buy supermarkets in this day and age. People want larger buildings. If they were to buy more land adjacent to that and build a larger building to something that would be marketable in the future, I've been told by commercial real estate dealers that it would trigger the use of fire sprinklers, which would become cost prohibitive. So those are when I say each property has a unique circumstance and a unique situation, that's the property we faced in Boyceville. And the only thing we could do to help people avoid bankruptcy was to offer them the possibility, if they chose, to sell to the city.
Instead of selling to the city, could they sell to the town and the town can conserve and maintain the property for its biodiversity?
The town does not have a capital fund to purchase properties like that, I'm sorry to say. Now, and the town would have a property in a 100-year floodplain.
Yeah, but you can
at great
conserve
risk.
and maintain the biodiversity instead of sending it to industry or selling it to commerce.
Well-
You can maintain a biodiversity here.
Ian,
It's part of the town, it's part of Olive.
there was a town recently in the New York Times where they bought a supermarket because they were in a food desert. But that town owned that supermarket, owned that land, owned the building and the land, and that was a fairly easy thing to do. You're talking about millions and millions of dollars in a capital projects that a town that has a $5.5 million budget. We don't have that in capital funding.
Thanks, Jim.
Now, there might be private, public, things, options available, and we're open to that. We're open to that. But the fact is, to build in the floodplain, to rebuild in the floodplain is not what we're interested in.
You don't want to capitalize, you want to maintain what you have. The greatest asset in Catskill Park is its biodiversity. And it's going because it's now being called Hampton North.
Oh, I get that.
So,
I get that. The funny thing about this conversation that I see is that we're not addressing the flooding issues.
Yeah.
You have a streamside acquisition program that is in Schoharie County, I believe, only.
Well, it's expanding, right?
It's expanding, I hope.
Yeah.
And, what we see here is we have people that have large tracts of land up on the mountainsides that are far from streams. And the city is buying those lands. I've seen it at the CWC, where they're buying large pieces of land when they have maybe a few acres of sensitive land. That's become an issue with us at the CWC, and we have very well let the DEP know that, as well as the National Academy of Sciences, when they came to ask us our perspective on how the DEP is operating. So we have concerns about the land acquisition program. And there's also concerns on the land acquisition program. Anecdotally, that I hear that people are not being allowed the ability to sell their land on very sensitive projects because the perspective I'm hearing, again, anecdotally, is that the DEP will say, you can't build there anyway, it's in a floodplain.
Right.
And so there seems to be this skewed
That's a
kind of
catch-22.
perspective. Like, there are people that own property and pieces of property that can never be developed because of their location. And very often the DEP won't buy it. And there are pieces of property that could provide relocation places, new housing, small business, and the DEP is buying those. That's kind of what I'm seeing a little bit just from my perspective. So
Thanks,
for your
Jim,
time. I don't
so
want
much
to
for
take
your expertise. I want to know if you got your answer.
No.
Okay, so there were some options, and what they thought is, rather than, the berm is what he was talking about. So it's basically,
I know what
and
a berm is.
right, but somebody else said, just build a dike and to keep it up there. And I think they did extensive research. Eddie, you were on that committee, weren't you? And it seemed like a good idea to a lot of us, but I guess, you know, engineering-wise it's feasible, but financially it was off. Okay, and Drew?
There's an awful lot of information about the berm, I'll say, that I don't think a lot of people really understand. One is the cost. And I'm going to say, forget about cost. Yeah, you could put one there. But the real problem in today's world is, first of all, by the way, if you put one there, the old sewing machine building and Ronson's piano building and the firehouse would have to go because that's where the berm would be. Okay, the real problem with the berm is getting FEMA certification for it. Because yeah, you could build a berm there, it might prevent flooding, but unless it's FEMA certified, it doesn't do anything to your flood insurance. So the people that you've got a berm there, if FEMA doesn't certify it, they still pay high insurance payments. And that's what really drove people like Cindy Johansson and Judy Gerard and company. That's what drove them out of the town, is the cost of insurance. The people that owned the Landmark Inn lost that property because of that. So we were in a difficult situation. There was no, I would say, there was no viable engineering solution to fix the flooding in Boyceville. It's a relatively small area, and there's room in both directions for people to actually develop if they want to. So it's not like, let's say, Margaretville or Phoenicia, where the whole town is almost flooded. This is a very small section. So, and the other thing that I think people put out there, everything on the south side of that's a functioning business right now. The IGA store, the pharmacy, the liquor store, Kitty's, the two restaurants that are there, the gas station, all that stuff is staying. None of those have asked to even participate in this program. And so, you know, the dike, I mean, I understand, I think the person that put that up there probably feels, well, we put an 8-foot berm in there when everybody's protected, but it doesn't do anything for the insurance. And there's a lot out there. In order for FEMA to think it's certified, an engineering firm has to actually come in and say it's certified. And it's starting to look like there's less and less people that are willing to do that, because ultimately the berm will fail someday.
Janine, I want to take one more question from Janine, and then I want to give our panelists 2 minutes each.
I'm Janine Fallon-Maurer. I'm an outsider, if you will, because I'm from Woodstock, and I don't live in the town of Olive, but I come here regularly to visit. I just wanted to I felt like it was time for us to circle back around. Because I can only speak to what I know and love, and that's history, and I would love Helen Chase, as the president of the Historical Society, to have a place other than her home to honor and preserve your historical records. So I just wrote on a note, and I'm going to give you this.
Thank you.
As a gift to the town of Olive, I would love to see the New York City give to the town of Olive Historical Society a preservation home for all of your records to live, where they're safe for everybody. We've been through that in Woodstock. We have a safe place for our records now. I think you need that, you deserve it, and I think that would be a great gift for New York City to give to the Historical Society. So that's what my energy is going to be thinking for you guys. And the politics of it is, you've got like a sticky wicket that I didn't realize. I knew you had one, but I knew you got 4 or 5.
It's never easy here, yeah.
So please try to keep the Historical Society out of that.
We will.
Or you'll never get.
We won't build it in the floodplain. How's that? Janine, thank you. I love wrapping things up on that, but I want to give our esteemed panelists just a few moments just to wrap up their thoughts. And thank you for being a phenomenal audience.
So I started with my 150 years of perspective, and that perspective is only available to me because historic and archaeological sites still exist. And so the more of these places that we lose, the less we'll be able to remember what happened and see that today it's Boyceville, Tomorrow it's going to be something else. The high priority acquisition areas are Broadhead and Ashokan, and right across from the rail trail. And the only potential for that rail trail to bring commerce and economy to this town is to keep that town there. If it's all forest and then a rail trail in the forest, what is it going to benefit, and who's going to be left to benefit from it?
Thank you, April. And LeAnne?
I was going to ask for another slide, but I'm not going to. I can quote it by heart. Is when a rural sociologist friend of mine, Jean Theodori, states, when you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. It can, and the reason is there's tremendous diversity in a rural community. We've seen it here, in whether it's things, places, memories, people, knowledge, that we do contribute a cultural diversity. And I think if anything I'd like to see changed is rural being looked at as an asset and what we have rather than what we lack. And there is an assumption to take from rural areas when in reality urban areas thrive in some cases not, because they have an attachment to rural areas. So I would like us to change the conversation and see rural communities and rural settings as sociocultural, ecological, diverse areas, and all of us coming together to solve the problems we have, because they aren't 100-year floods anymore. You know, I live also in Shenango Bridge. Floods are 5 years.
Yeah, every 5 years we get one of those 100 years.
So
we haven't talked about climate change, which we could go on and on about. Didn't mean to cut you off.
Climate change.
But my point is, there's a lot of diverse knowledge out there, and I think that's where we come together and looking at that knowledge base and those areas from which that knowledge comes as valued.
Thank you, Dr. Avery. LeAnne, I propose that before we hear from Mr. Adam, that we think about creating an Ashokan Cultural Alliance here today, and Adam Bosch.
So when Kate invited me to come, I agreed because, you know, we really feel like it's important to keep the lines of communication open with everyone who lives, works, and plays in the watershed. It's really, really important. Here in Olive, I think it's especially important because we have a lot of things going on now and a lot of things that are going to be going on in the future. So right now, obviously, we have land acquisition program, which we were talking about here today, but we're replacing the 5 Arches Bridge next year, starting next year. There's going to be work to do some initial upgrades on 28A in a few years. We're going to be replacing eventually the Dividing Weir Bridge. We're going to be doing work on a lot of things at Ashokan Reservoir. Obviously the rail trails here. So there's just a lot of stuff going on, and you deserve to know what's going on, why it's happening, and what it means for you. And so long as I'm in this job, my pledge is that I'm going to be here to speak to you about that and give you the most best information you can possibly get. So that's why I wanted to come here today, and I'm going to mill around for a while after in case anyone had a question that we didn't get to.
Yeah, and grab his business card. His door is always open, I think. I don't know about that. Also, you have a terrific elected, a bunch of people here that love the town of Olive, and there's one of our national treasures right there, Mr. Sherritt Chase. He'll tell you about a 100-year plan, won't he? 102. Thank you, Sherritt. It's 4:03. I want to thank you for your time and again, the Olive Free Library for this forum, this opportunity. I don't know that we settled anything, but I hope you feel like you got some thinking done. I think Jack Conaway's idea of a comprehensive plan going forward is a great one. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.